Hello, I'm Gaurav Sharma from Hitbullseye.com, and in this lecture we shall study about international institutions which have affected the global economy. Going through the history, we see that the economy of the world was initially based upon primarily mercantilism, in which certain global powers were bent upon having colonialism and imperialism as their foreign policy. But we see that there was a change after the Second World War, in which there were certain international institutions like World Bank and IMF, which gave effect to the changing world order, which were very essential in globalizing the world economy. But again, there were certain drawbacks of such international institutions, and some world leaders like Kwame Nkrumah had also claimed that such institutions are only propagating neo-colonialism. So again, there were certain developing nations like BRICS, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They formed a new development bank, which was also called as BRICS Bank. And again, there was another international institution that was called as Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. So we'll begin after the First World War. The major institutions, the origin can be attributed towards a conference which was held in 1944 in Brentwood, New Hampshire. Now, the first institution was the IMF and the World Bank, which were together called as Bretton Woods twins. And then there was a agreement that was called as General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, which eventually gave way to World Trade Organization, which came into effect after the Marrakesh Agreement in 1944. Now, one of the Bretton Woods twins was International Monetary Fund. The major objectives of such an institution was to survey the international financial systems. Now, we have in the previous lectures we have studied balance of payment. Now, it is a record of the economic transactions of a country with foreign or other countries. Now, IMF is the guiding body which guides the monetary authorities of each country towards having a stable monetary policy or a foreign trade policy. Now, this is the primary objective of IMF, and moreover, again, coordination of monetary policy with the central banks in India, which would be RBI, and it is the lender of last resort in case of a balance of payment crisis. And of course, it provides technical assistance, training, and advisory towards all its members. And its one of the fundamental duties is to support global growth and employment generation. So these are the primary objective of International Monetary Fund. Now, one of the very important aspects which was originated by the IMF in the previous lecture was also started the currency exchange rate and how it was determined, how it evolved from a gold standard to a dollar standard, and in the 1970s, that is in 1967, SDR, that is special drawing rights, came into being, and eventually 1 SDR became equal to 1 US dollar or 0.88 grams of gold. This is also called as paper gold. Now, in the present system, 1 SDR is it's a cumulative price which has certain currencies in its basket. At present, it's dollar, euro, pound, and yen. SDRs are not minted, but they're a part of the interest reserve asset. Foreign exchange reserves are also composed of SDRs along with gold and reserve transposition and of course foreign currency asset. So SDRs are a part of the foreign exchange reserves of which are maintained by the central banks of each country. And of course these can be traded. And moreover, SDRs can be used to draw money. For example, SDRs can be exchanged with respect to dollars depending upon the exchange rate of which is determined by the International Monetary Fund. Now let's just briefly see and review the working of IMF. IMF Executive Board decides the quota of each member on basis of various parameters including GDP and tariff barriers. So the higher the GDP, the greater the quota, and lesser the tariff barriers, again greater the quota. Now India's quota has risen from 2.445 to 2.75, that is, it has become one of the top 10 quota holders in the world, which also includes USA as well as China. The higher quota, higher voting rights, and of course, borrowing permissions. Five largest quota holders permanently decide 5 out of 24 directors. Now, at present, the director of IMF is Christine Lagarde. She's from France. And of course, eventually we see that IMF needs certain regulations because we see that the Bretton Woods twins, both World Bank and IMF, are both dominated by Western powers. So in the future, we see that certain evolution of certain institutions which promotes the interests of developing and underdeveloped countries will take place. The World Bank also came into existence as the result of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and is the other member of the Bretton Woods twins. Now it now consists of five organizations, that is IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, International Development Agency. Now these two basically consisted of the World Bank initially. Now three more organizations: International Finance Corporation, Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and ICSID, International Center for Settlement of International Disputes. Now World Bank was IBRD and IDA initially. So this all together is called as the World Bank Group. Now the third important economic institutions which was very important in order to regulate the international trade was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, which came into effect in 1948. But again, this was not a binding, it was not a legally binding, so there was no legal enforcement power associated with GATT. And eventually, after the Uruguay round, WTO was came into being in order to replace the GATT, and Marrakesh Agreement was formed. And the major important part was that WTA was a legally binding agreement on the member countries. Now, after the Marrakesh Agreement, WTO was formed, and the major objectives which were kept in mind while forming the WTO were that it should create a transparency in world economy. It should be free and rule-based trading system. That means that it should not be biased towards certain countries, for example, developed countries or Western nations, but it should be a transparent system in which the interests of the developing and underdeveloped countries should also be taken care of. Second, the provision of common institutional framework for the conduct of trade relations. Third, facilitation of implementation, administration of multilateral trade agreements. For example, free trade agreements, FTAs, this shall be facilitated by the WTO. And of course, provision for dispute settlement and mechanisms, trade policy review mechanisms. The major principles on which the WTO was formed was it shall be non-discriminatory in nature, most favored nation, and national treatment. This means that the interests of each member country shall be taken care of and no bias shall be done. And of course, market access, reduction of bindings and tariff, elimination of quantitative restrictions of imports and exports. In the other lectures we have also covered in the international foreign trade, we've seen that there are certain trade barriers and or which are also called as tariff and non-tariff barriers. So please have a look on that. And WTO was responsible towards creating a globalized economy, and these barriers or quota restrictions should be reduced such that the world trade flourishes. So in order to facilitate the international global trade, there are certain subsidies which were classified by the WTO such that they can be termed as trade distorting or non-distorting. A green box subsidy and blue box subsidy are called as non-trade distorting. On the other hand, amber box subsidies are considered as distortionary in nature and thus are restricted 5% for developed countries and 10% for developing countries. For a detailed view, please watch the video which relates to such subsidy and foreign trade. We've already discussed that initially, though these economic institutions did globalize the economy, but eventually there were certain problems which were associated with this. For example, the dominance of Western countries. An American citizen has always headed the World Bank, and on the other hand, International Monetary Fund was always headed by a European, and thus the interests of these nations always were on the main agenda of these Bretton Woods twins. The rise of BRICS nations, of course, the most fast developing countries formed a group called as BRICS, which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And of course, they had to keep their interests in mind, so therefore, they formed certain international institutions to propagate their interests as well. Faulty voting system, which was based upon quota, and majority of the quota lied with the major economic powers, which skewed the international trade in their favor. Conditional loans. IMF also gave loan to India in case of balance of payment crisis of 1991. But on the other hand, India had to open up its market, reduce its tariff, which were very, very harmful for the domestic Indian industry, and thus such conditional loans are very harmful for the national economies as such. The rising financing needs for developing world. We see that there are certain limitations to which these institutions can give loans to certain areas. For example, World Bank can give a certain quota, like for example 20 billion to the South Asian economy and to Latin and other African nations as well. So India on the other hand needs quite a lot of capital, and these institutions were not able to provide that capital, so we had to look for other options for creating capital and investment in India, and thus the BRICS nations together formed a new development bank. Now it was founded at the 6th BRICS summit at Fortaleza, Brazil in July 2014. The operations may start this year. The headquartered at Shanghai. The first president is KV Kamath from India, and all the 5 members have equal voting rights. The major functions that were associated with New Development Bank were the loans for infrastructure and sustainable development projects. Thus, it promoted the growth of such countries. See, India always needs investment for propagation. We do not have the capital, so we will take loans from New Development Bank. Secondly, helping member countries in balance of payment crisis. Therefore, if any country faces a balance of payment crisis, we have another option of going towards the NDP and not going for IMF and not having certain conditions associated with such loans. The initial subscribed capital was of 50 billion and the contingency reserve arrangement of 100 billion which was reserved for balance of payment crisis. तो अगर इंडिया या साउथ अफ्रीका या किसी भी ब्रिक्स नेशन को ऐसी क्राइसिस आ जाए तो दे कैन ऑलवेज अवेल दिस फंड. सो हमें IMF में जाने की ज़रूरत नहीं पड़ेगी, वहाँ से कंडीशंस हमें अपनी टैरिफ घटाने नहीं पड़ेंगे, हमें लॉस नहीं होगा, हमारे जो एक्सपोर्ट पोटेंशियल होगा वो मेंटेन करके रख सकते हैं. सो दिस इज़ द बेनिफिट ऑफ हैविंग अ न्यू डेवलपमेंट बैंक. एंड अनदर Asian institution which came into fray was the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. The idea of such a bank was given by China. There were 57 prospective founding members. The authorized capital is 100 billion and the voting rights with respect to India, we have the second largest voting right with 7.5% share, and China obviously has the largest share. The headquarters of II will be at Beijing. Okay. Another economic institutions which were more effective in Europe in promoting their economy was the European Union, which came into being after the Maastricht Treaty. Maastricht is a place in Netherlands. It established a European Union and European citizenship. Political economic union of 28 states. Major economic institutions are European Commission, the Court of Justice of European Union, European Central Bank and European Parliament. The monetary union was established in 1999 and came into force in 2002. That is establishment of a eurozone with a common currency called euro. It has 19 members. Now, another economic institution which was important with respect to India was the Asian Development Bank, which was headquartered in Manila, Philippines, and as of now has 66 members. The main drawback of Asian Development Bank was it was dominated by Japan, and India did not receive as many loans through ADB, and thus the major functions were loans, equity investment in member countries, technical assistance, and assistance to formulating development policy. So the main functions were similar to those of World Bank or IMF, but again, we did not get as much loans that we would have wanted because there was a quota system. Asian ADB can give only certain amount of loans, quantitative amount of loans to South Asia, and thus we did not actually get too many loans from such institutions. But again, as a whole, it was very important for the Asian economy. Another important economic institutions with respect to Europe is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Initially, there was an organization for European Economy and Cooperation, that is called the EEC, which was established in 1947 to run the Marshall Plan. Now, Marshall Plan was something which was run by the Americans, USA, to facilitate the unity and propagation of NATO forces, North Atlantic TT organization, against the Soviet Union. This was a part of all the Cold War which was present at the time, and later in 1960s it's transformed into OECD, that is the present form, and today it has 34 members. Now, in this lecture we have started how the international economy was influenced by international institutions which were formed after the Second World War, the World Bank, IMF, and how the changing dynamics have led to the formation of New Development Bank or BRICS Bank and the AIIB. And I believe that it shall be very, very important that India grows as an economy because we have a high and a rich human resource. Now with this, we have completed the series on international business environment. Till we meet next time, good luck, work hard, and hit the bullseye. Thank you.